Well, howdy there, Internet people. It's Bo again. So, today we're going to talk about somebody you know. You know the name, you know of his common sense. Somebody who is described as a journalist by trade and a propagandist by inclination. He was a founder of the United States, the spiritual father of the Revolution. Because of that, you may have some ideas about him. You may have an image, because we have a standard image of the founders of this country. It might surprise you. He was a pretty progressive guy. He was a man that, he was quoted by Ronald Reagan. He was also described as the chief propagandist and agitator of the revolution by the Communist Party. He not only helped shape the United States. To be honest, without him, the United States may not exist. The colonists really didn't know they were fighting a revolution until he told them they were. Not just did he shape here, he assisted in the French Revolution. He really pushed back against the idea of monarchy everywhere. He's a person who described government, even in its best state, as a necessary evil, and in its worst state, an intolerable one. He was almost executed once. He led a life of tragedy. And at the end, his funeral was pretty sparsely attended. So today, we're going to talk about the roads of Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was born in England in the 1730s. Due to a change in dating convention, it could be listed as January 29th, 1736, or as February 9th, 1737. His father was a tenant farmer and corset maker. Paine apprenticed with his father and then served as a privateer, a state-sanctioned pirate. He sailed for the British, mainly targeting French warships. Paine, soldier of fortune, had a financially successful venture and took some time to study the theories of the Enlightenment after the voyage. In 1759, he returned to Great Britain and became a corset maker. In September 1759, he married Mary. Shortly thereafter, his business fell apart and Mary got pregnant. She went into early labor. Paine lost his wife and child. This shaped some of his views about social safety nets. By 1762, he was a tax collector. He was fired in 1765 for claiming to inspect goods he hadn't. He fought the accusation and worked as a school teacher in London, but eventually wound up working as an excise officer in Lewes in Sussex. Sussex had a revolutionary spirit left over from the previous century and a strong undercurrent of belief in a republic. He became lightly involved in civic matters and married his landlord's daughter in 1771. Paine argued for better pay and working conditions for excise officers. He wrote a 12-page pamphlet called The Case of the Officers of Excise. It was his first known political writing. By 1774, he was again fired from the service for being absent without permission. He was about to end up in debtor's prison, but sold off almost everything he owned. His wife and he separated, and he moved back to London. He met Benjamin Franklin, who suggested moving to America. Franklin even wrote him a letter of recommendation. Paine left for the Americas in October of 1774. Okay, so the Boston Massacre's already happened. The Boston Tea Party's already happened. The First Continental Congress has already met. And Paine is still in Great Britain. How did this happen? How did this guy earn the title of the father of the Revolution? Without the pen of Paine, the sword of Washington would have been wielded in vain. John Adams. He hit the ground running, kind of. When the ship made it to Philadelphia, Paine was sick. Typhoid had killed 5 during the trip. Benjamin Franklin's doctor, who was at the docks to welcome Paine to the New World, had the ill man carried off the ship. It took a month and a half to recover from the illness. He wrote a couple of articles for Pennsylvania Magazine in early 1775, and by March he was editor. The owner wanted to keep the magazine apolitical, but Paine had other plans. He saw a platform that could be used as a nursery of genius for a new nation. Under Paine, the magazine's circulation grew rapidly. It became the most widely read magazine in the colonies. The first month Paine was editor, the magazine published an abolitionist essay called African Slavery in America. It was published anonymously, but it is widely believed to be Paine's own writing. All right, so Paine's been in the colonies like 4 months. And in 4 months, he's already identified the fact that a new nation is on the way and that slavery is going to have to be abolished. It's an idea that didn't really earn him a lot of friends with a lot of powerful people. For his part, Paine never owned a slave, and he actively spoke out against it pretty much any chance he had. When talking about the vengeance that self-liberated slaves sought in Haiti, he said that it was the natural consequence of slavery and that it should be expected everywhere. That was a statement that, well, terrified a lot of slave owners in the colonies. At this point in time, the revolutionaries didn't know they were revolutionaries because Paine hadn't told them that's what they were yet. Patrick Henry was just getting ready to say, "I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." In April, the battles of Lexington and Concord happened. June was Bunker Hill. The fighting was real and it was fierce. But at this point, it was viewed as a civil war over how the British should treat the colonists. The anger among colonists was focused primarily at the officers of the Crown, those they saw on a daily basis. Then, in January of 1776, Common Sense was published. It was signed by an anonymous Englishman. Paine didn't take credit initially. He wanted to call the pamphlet Plain Truth, but Benjamin Rush convinced him to rename it and had cautioned him to keep the language mild. Of more worth is one honest man to society and in the sight of God than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived. Crowned ruffian wasn't exactly mild language when all of the large powers were monarchies. Common Sense was read aloud in taverns and churches. The arguments contained in the short text shifted the entire focus of the conflict. People were no longer concerned with obtaining better treatment. They wanted a new nation, a nation of their own. Paine shifted the blame from the visible forces of the crown to the king himself. He took on the idea of monarchy. He also chose to meet the reader where they were. The ideas in Common Sense weren't new, but Paine chose to express those ideas in a manner that allowed everybody to understand them. Not everybody was a scholar, and the less hierarchical government he envisioned required the consent of everybody. He sought to win hearts and minds by using the common language to express his common sense. The popularity of the pamphlet was unparalleled. It was read everywhere. Okay, so we've heard it our entire lives. Common Sense is this great document, this great text. It stirred the hearts of people. It triggered the American Revolution because he laid out these great arguments and he spoke to people in a language that they understood. And this is why Thomas Paine is the spiritual and philosophical founder of the United States. We hear that all the time. Without Thomas Paine, without Common Sense, there would be no United States. And we hear people talk about how great his arguments were. But we rarely hear what his arguments were. We don't hear him summarized very often. And when people talk about his delivery, they tend to leave one little detail out because it goes against American mythology. Okay, so what were the arguments? The first one's real simple. England didn't have authority to rule. Hereditary rule was bad, and we just weren't having anything to do with it. Another was that because of immigration, Americans were their own people. They were distinct. They weren't English. They were American. They had their own customs. From the very beginning, immigration was seen as one of the things that made America, America. He also said that England wasn't a good steward. They weren't looking out for us the way a good parent should. They weren't helping us develop. They were looking to exploit us. He also pointed out that the king kept dragging us into wars that well, had nothing to do with us. It was stuff going on the other side of the Atlantic, and yet we wound up fighting in it. Nobody likes that. And then, on the topic of the other side of the Atlantic, he points out that the king couldn't govern effectively because of the Atlantic, because of the time delay. It was just ineffective rule, and therefore no rule at all. And then he pointed out that the king wasn't looking out for our best interests, that London should look out for the best interest of London, and the colonies should look out for the best interest of the colonies, that local rule was best, that those who were immediately available could be more responsive to the needs of the people. It all makes sense. Good arguments. That's what stirred people. That's what stirred people's hearts. That's what got them desiring revolution instead of reform. Now, when people talk about his delivery, they often point out that he spoke in the language of the common man. And he did. This was a man who was very well educated. And he could have written this in an academic format, but he chose not to. But aside from that, Paine wasn't religious. But he sure used a lot of quotes from the Bible, alluded to it a whole lot, because he knew that that was something that would stir the hearts of people and get them motivated. That often gets left out because there's the image that the United States was founded by Christians. It just wouldn't do for the spiritual and philosophical father of the revolution to not be a religious person. It wasn't without its detractors. James Chalmers said that without a monarch, the country would degenerate into democracy. Many conservatives of the time viewed democracy the way socialism is viewed by conservatives today, something relatively unknown, to be feared. John Adams, who would later sing the praises of Paine, took issue not with the idea of democracy itself, but with Paine's extreme version of it, one that included allowing men who didn't own property to hold office and vote. While scholars of today will often debate why common sense was so successful and how much of an impact it had on history, the mark it left on the American Revolutionary and on the American psyche was immense and survives to this day as Ivy League candidates attempt to speak to the common man. As the war progressed, Paine wrote more propagandist text for the cause. The American Crisis, published in 1776, is an often quoted motivational text that Washington had read aloud to his troops. In it, Paine appealed for the proper application of force and wanted a trained military to replace the militias. It should be noted, this later became American policy. In 1777, Paine was involved in foreign affairs for the Congress. Paine lost more friends when he spoke against war profiteering by public officials. The scandal centered on Silas Deane. Paine demanded a public investigation into his suspected financial ties. Deane was defended by wealthy public officials, including John Jay, who saw no issue with holding public positions while also profiting from personal business deals with governments. Paine, father of the Revolution, was denounced as being unpatriotic and attacked by Deane's supporters in the streets. Paine left the Committee of Foreign Affairs with his reputation in tatters. It should be noted that years later, the corruption Paine alleged was widely acknowledged. He even received apologies from some of those who attacked his name. Paine continued his relentless assault on the wealthy and powerful in public good. The pamphlet suggested that land west of the 13 colonies belonged to the U.S. government and to the people of the new nation. Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and James Madison all had personal claims to lands in the region Paine was suggesting belonged to everybody. It should be noted the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 agreed with Paine's position. At the time, however, his long list of attacks against the wealthy and powerful left him with limited friends. Only the most forward-thinking of his contemporaries were still around. He left with critic of slavery Lieutenant Colonel John Lorenz for France to obtain funding for the Revolution. Over the course of 6 months in 1781, Lorenz and Paine succeeded in securing funding for the war effort, with Benjamin Franklin acting as facilitator for meetings. Upon return, they were welcome. Paine, who donated royalties from Common Sense to the war effort, objected to the idea of being paid for their services. By 1787, he was back in London. When the French Revolution popped off in 1789, Paine was intrigued, and in 1790, he was there. Edmund Burke released a counter-revolutionary pamphlet that appealed to the ruling class. Paine sought to undermine it with his work, Rights of Man. Unlike much of his early work, Rights of Man wasn't short. It was almost 100,000 words long. It didn't just attack monarchies, but went after many social traditions of the day. It was so radical, he had trouble finding a publisher at first. However, once he had, it sold 1 million copies. Because of the success, the ruling class kind of had to respond, right? They slandered him. They tried to discredit him. In response, he published Part 2 of Rights of Man. He wanted to do away with the idea that those who were born into money and power were inherently better leaders, and he made his case for that. A lot of what I'm about to say is going to sound real familiar. He believed that the youth was the real key. Because of that, he believed in universal education, wanted equal access to education for the poor. He believed that if people were educated, they would be less reliant on social safety nets. And he was going to propose a few of them. He wanted education because he believed that those people who didn't have it, well, they would just end up laboring in professions. They would stay economically disadvantaged, and they'd stay in poverty, and that poverty would create crime. It makes sense. He wanted to alleviate that, and he wanted to create some social mobility. And to help achieve this, he proposed tax cuts for the poor, not the rich. He advocated for maternity benefits, payments to newlyweds, wanted the state to pay for some funerals. He advocated for higher taxes on the wealthy and taxes on luxury. That ruffled some feathers. Wanted an old age pension program and total employment. He described these workhouses where people could go if they were down on their luck. They would be given room and board and a stipend. They could stay as long as they want. They would be hired. No discrimination. And it would help them get back on their feet. This really angered the ruling classes a lot. They incited even more hatred against him. He was chased by mobs, burned in effigy. The authorities wanted to try him. He wound up having to flee the country. They tried him in his absence and found him guilty anyway. But luckily for him, he was unavailable for the hanging they had in store for him. In response to the charges of sedition and libel, he said, "If, to expose the fraud and imposition of monarchy, to promote universal peace, civilization, and commerce, and to break the chains of political superstition and raise degraded man to his proper rank, if these things be libelous, let the name of libeler be engraved on my tomb." In France, Rights of Man was well received. Paine was given honorary French citizenship. Even though he couldn't speak French, he was elected to a parliament of the French Revolution. After being elected, he was placed on the convention's constitutional committee. He helped in the drafting and voted for a French republic. However, being opposed to capital punishment, argued that the king should be exiled. The king was later executed. Paine was arrested in France in 1793. The reasoning isn't entirely clear, but that was kind of the times. A number of prominent Americans attempted to secure his release, but for the moment, he was headed to the guillotine. Now, this is the point where we could definitely have a different ending to this story. But luckily, Paine kept his cool, kept his head. See, the jailer would walk up and down the hallway and put a chalk mark on the door of prisoners that were to be taken out the next morning. When the jailer walked by Paine's door, the door was open. So when the jailer made his mark, And then the door was shut. The mark was on the inside. So the next morning, Paine wasn't taken out. He wasn't led to the guillotine. This saved his neck for a few days. And in a bizarre twist of fate, it was in that time span that the new American minister to France, James Monroe, was able to secure his release. In July of 1795, he was readmitted to the French National Convention. Paine opposed the adoption of the new French Constitution because it did away with the universal suffrage promised in the 1794 Constitution. The old saying that the most radical revolutionary becomes a conservative the day after the rebellion didn't apply to Paine. In 1796, a bridge he designed was built in England. His design became the prototype for many single-span iron bridges. The design obtained a patent in Britain. He developed a smokeless candle and helped other inventors. He also provided advice to Napoleon on his planned invasion of England. Napoleon wound up being a fan of Paine's. Paine felt betrayed by the American Revolution. He saw the failing to help revolutionary France as an insult to those Americans who died for the idea of removing monarchies. Speaking of George Washington, he said, "The world will be puzzled to decide whether you are an apostate or an impostor, whether you have abandoned good principles or whether you ever had any." He only came back to the U.S. in 1802 when President Jefferson requested it. Paine died on June 8, 1809 in Greenwich Village, New York City. His funeral was attended by less than a dozen people. The great agnostic Robert G. Ingersoll wrote, "Thomas Paine had passed the legendary limit of life. One by one, most of his old friends and acquaintances had deserted him, maligned on every side, execrated, shunned, and abhorred. His virtues denounced as vices, his services forgotten, his character blackened. He preserved the poise and balance of his soul. He was a victim of the people, but his convictions remained unshaken. He was still a soldier in the army of freedom, and still tried to enlighten and civilize those who were impatiently waiting for his death. Even those who loved their enemies hated him, their friend, the friend of the whole world, with all of their hearts." On the 8th of June, 1809, death came. Death, almost his only friend. At his funeral, no pomp, no pageantry, no civic procession, no military display. So there you have it. He started with nothing, ended with nothing, but accomplished a whole lot along the way. He did this and was able to do it because he never sacrificed his principles. He stayed fighting for freedom his entire life, advocating for the betterment of man, the betterment of humanity. He also shatters a lot of stereotypes that we have about the founders of this country. He avoided the most horrible practices that are associated with many of them and openly condemned them because he wanted freedom, real freedom. He wanted to move society forward. He wanted to take society down that road, a society that would lead to something better. And he was willing to put his own neck on the line, literally, to do it. He is not the best known founder of this country, but he's probably one of the most important. I think we can probably all learn a whole lot from the footsteps in the roads of Thomas Paine. The aristocracy are not the farmers who work the land, but are the mere consumers of the rent.